slavery is an issue that is used to shame the West. It's used to shame Westerners. And I feel it is time that we do start to look at something that a slave trade that went on for 4 times longer and was anything up to 200 times bigger than what we call the Atlantic slave trade. Ibn Khaldun is essentially the most famous historian in the Islamic world. And he wrote that sub-Saharan Africans in the Arab slave trade were submissive to slavery, and specifically said, therefore the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because Negroes have little that is essentially human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. Okay, this is written in the Muqaddimah. So that's Ibn Khaldun, Khaldun. So, moving on. Now, something that is commonly used, especially in my debates, and is I hear that Islam is intolerant of enslaving human beings, that Islam eradicated slavery, Muhammad was an abolitionist, and so on. Reza Aslan and others have made this claim, and I've heard this claim repeated endlessly, and I wanted to verify if this was the case. Now, we know, if you look at the myth versus the truth, Muhammad captured, he owned, and he sold slaves. The Quran explicitly gives slave owners the freedom to sexually exploit their slaves. Islamic law, the Sharia, is littered with rules concerning the treatment of slaves. Now, some of these rules certainly can be viewed as humane, but not one prohibits the practice of slavery. Now, the presence of these rules would seem to condone and legalize slavery in Islam. Also, add to this fact, Muhammad was an avid slave trader. So after providing ample evidence of, if we go, so later on we will look through the Islamic doctrine, look through the scriptures, and we're going to provide as much written evidence from the doctrine as we can to show you just how much Muhammad was involved in the slave trade himself and Islam's legal rulings on the matter. So Muhammad captured slaves, he sold slaves, he bought slaves as gifts of pleasure, sexual pleasure for himself and for his friends. He received slaves as gifts, he used them for work. And the Sirah, which is his biography, is very clear on the issue of slavery. Okay, even the very pulpit that Muhammad preached Islam from was built by slave labor at his directive. So the Quran tells Muslims to emulate the example of Muhammad, who was the most exalted character, who was the ideal Muslim, perfect man. So this is what Muhammad did. This becomes sunnah. This becomes what is allowable, permissible for all time. So now slavery, because of this, has been a tradition of Islam for 14 centuries, including the modern plight of non-Muslim slaves in the Sudan, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, Libya, where there are open-air slave markets today, and other parts of the Muslim world. Low estimates are over 20 million Africans alone were enslaved. Right? And that's a low estimate. The estimates run up to 80 million. So I'm going with the low estimate. You have 20 million Africans alone enslaved. 6 out of every 10 black boys between 8 and 12 that were taken were castrated. Okay, 6 out of every 10 black boys between 8 and 12. The Caliph in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century had 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 whites. This is from Ronald Siegel, Islam's Black Slaves, the Other Diaspora. Interesting book that covers that topic. So the Arab-Islamic slave trade also ushered in the European slave trade. The Portuguese got their start as middlemen for Arab-Islamic slavers. The Portuguese were transporting African slaves along the African coast for them. Right? Also, Arab slavery sparked one of the largest slave rebellions in history. This is called the Zand Rebellion, and this was near Basra in southern Iraq. And this happened over a period of 15 years, from AD 869 to AD 883. Now, the harsh treatment of Africans in salt mines involved over 500,000 slaves and free men. Right? So these are things that people can go and look up. So these are references people can look up and see for themselves. Now, Islamic slavers often avoided teaching Islam to blacks to justify enslaving them. It was against their interest to convert them. Now, something which I do mention in the text is that often, if you look at America, the way that blacks are converted to Islam, they get told that Islam is the religion of black people and Christianity that of white people. Yet Islam has a horrible history of enslaving black people, far worse than anything that happened in the West. So Islamic slavery is the longest, yet is also the least discussed of the major slave trades. It predates the Atlantic slave trade by 700 years. It even continued up until the 1960s, and in fact, Mauritania criminalized slavery only in August of 2007.
Wow.
So so now some slaves were granted freedom, sure, and this is something that Islamic apologists will throw out. But then so were American slaves. Many American slaves also became men of wealth. In fact, a large number of black Americans owned slaves and were themselves wealthy due to the slave trade. One of the earliest slave owners in the U.S. was a black man, but that's a different topic. So Arab Islamic slavery was not limited to Africa. Slaves were taken from all racial groups. Now, I will go into more depth with some of these points as we go through the text. During the 9th and the 10th centuries, in fact, most slaves were Europeans, not black. Now, we know that the Arab slave traders took anywhere up to, if not more than, 1.5 million European slaves from North Africa and took them to Arabia. Sorry, took Europeans to North Africa and Arabia. Now, the numbers move between 1.25 million to 1.5 million. There may be more, but those are conservative numbers. Those are numbers that can be verified. Now, what is interesting is that if we look at the number of blacks that were taken from Africa across the Atlantic to North America, we're looking at 350,000. And yet this 1.5 million goes unremarked. Okay? Now, points of interest. There's never been an abolitionary movement within Islam. And I have to ask why. Why has there never been? Abolition came out of Christianity, came from Westerners like William Wilberforce, but we'll get to that.
Yeah,
so
white Christians actually led the charge against slavery, which is another thing that is very seldom discussed.
Correct, and I feel that these are points that people need to start looking at. Now, there was so much material that I had to condense. I mean, it was difficult to decide what to include, what to exclude. But we're looking at a slave trade that lasted 1,300 years versus a slave trade, the Western slave trade, which lasted only 300 years and was ended. So Westerners were the last to enter the slave trade and the first to end it. In fact, the only culture to ever end it. And in fact, they forced other cultures to end it as well. So the abolition of slavery was imposed in the Islamic world by European countries, right? And so along with all this political pressure, this was unrelated to Islamic law, because if Islam is so moral, why did it never end slavery? How come it has such a long history of over 1,000 years? So now, although all this is well documented, there's been no shaming of the Arabs, there's been no shaming of Islam, as in the West, nor has there been an apology. The West often grovels and talks about, oh my God, we're so sorry for slavery. So now the absence of guilt would lead some to think that, okay, well, slavery wasn't so bad under Islam, or, that we have nothing to feel guilty about. However, what this actually shows is that the absence of guilt is a sign of the tolerance that Islam has for slavery. The fact that there's no guilt means that actually tells you, well, they don't care. They don't see it as a sin, as a crime against humanity. Now, the caliphs with the religious equivalent of the popes, they often maintained harems of hundreds, often thousands of young girls and women captured from lands as far away as Europe, okay, for sexual slavery. White, blonde women were the most popular slaves, because they were the most desirable, the most attractive, and therefore the most expensive. Okay. Now, Hungarians were hunted like animals by the Turks. The Turks took 3 million Hungarians into slavery over a 150-year period in the 1500s and the 1600s. Why is there no discussion of that? Again, we hear endlessly about 300 to 400,000 slaves that were taken to the U.S.
I want to add right there, too, very quickly, the Serbs were also hunted and brought into slavery, and it was the Serbs who really took the blunt of the force to keep Islam out of Europe. And then, of course, Kosovo and oh, goodness, right when I go to say it, I forget it, Bosnia were actually overtaken by it.
Yeah, so these are points. I mean, people can go look this up. and start looking for themselves, start hunting around. Now, the Hungarians, as I said, hunted by the Turks. In India, now India is, man, it's a subject entirely on its own. It is known that the Mughals, I believe the dynasty, the Islamic dynasty in India was called, they wiped out 2/3 of the Hindu population of India at one point. But anyway, that's a separate topic. Again, in India, 200,000 Hindus were captured and transported to Iranian slave markets in between 1619 and 1620. So now African slaves were often castrated by their Muslim masters, right? Few survived to reproduce, which is why there are very few blacks in the Middle East. There are almost no blacks in the Middle East. Now, if you look at the US, you've got 30 plus million blacks who are there now, who are the descendants of the slaves that came across to the US. What also is not discussed, if you look, 15 million slaves left west from African shores, went west to the Americas. 350 to 400,000 went to North America. The other 14.6 million went to South America. That also does not get discussed. 14.5 million black slaves went to brown South America. Why is this not discussed? Why the endless focus on North American slavery? So now there were 1,300 years of Arab slave trading, and there was only 300 years of European slavery, and this was eventually ended because it was felt to be a moral crime and, a moral aberration, an abomination, and a crime. So now, something I want to note when they talk about the castration of African slaves is that if you look at Quran 24:31, right, I can click on the link and you can see that this is real. Should we actually go there, you can see this is right here. And the word slaves appears, so that is there. Say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. They should not display their beauty or ornaments except, and here we go, and one of the categories of people, their husbands or their fathers, their husbands' fathers, and also all male slaves free of physical needs. These are men who've been castrated, and thus the women can display themselves in front of these men because these men are free of physical needs. Now notice the language is euphemistic. Males free of physical needs. Well, they chopped off, they removed the penis and your scrotum. That's why you are free of physical needs. And
so
this might
have
happened.
It wasn't just castration; it was full removal. Wow.
Correct. You understand? Now, in some cases, it might have, but yeah, this was the case. Okay. So understand that this is where this. So sometimes the Quran or the other Islamic books are written to present a prettier picture than actually is the case. Okay, so we have to be very careful of the translations we use.
Let me just interrupt you. Somebody is saying in the chat, no, it only means older men.
No, there is a reference to actually older men in some of the texts. That actually does come up as a separate category. But male slaves free of physical needs, that is what it says. And you can go to the tafsirs and you can read that for yourself, but even the tafsirs are themselves a little confusing there. So anyway, we have spoken now. We have 30 million blacks now in the U.S. They've got a higher standard of living than their African peers. I mean, America is a wonderful country, so one has to wonder, So let us now look at something that is not commonly considered, is the Irish slave trade. These are the forgotten white slaves. So the majority of the early slaves to the New World were white. Okay? Between 1641 and 1652, 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. So Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000 in one decade. Right? Irish slaves were treated worse than, as far as we know, any other slaves in history. Right? Many people now.
And when I bring this up, people say, "Oh, Jan is lying," But yeah, I mean, this is well known. Well, I mean, known by some who actually care about facts, anyway.
Yeah. Look, one can debate what's worse, but slavery is bad. Now, let's draw the line. Slavery is bad. Okay. But many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they were. They were slaves. What they try to say is they were indentured servants. They were slaves. They were very badly treated. Right? There were people without a home. They were stolen from their homes. They were killed. They were slaughtered. They were taken, and they were forced to be slave labor. Now, What people don't know is on June 20th, 1631, an invasion force of pirates on the Barbary coast, Barbary coast of North Africa, backed by elite troops of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, stormed ashore at the quiet village of Baltimore in Ireland, also known as the Stolen Village of Baltimore. They abducted nearly every villager for sale on slave markets. 2 Baltimore men were killed as they made a bid to stop 230 armed invaders, Islamic invaders. Now, this scene is almost forgotten today, right? And it's one of the most devastating invasions of the island of Britain by Islamic forces. 107 people, mostly women and children, were herded like cattle and taken to a life of slavery in Algiers. Only 2 or perhaps 3 of them ever saw their home again. Now, these weren't Irish people. These were actually English people who had rented the port. These were fishermen. Now, what is interesting, notice Murat Rais, the Islamic pirate captain who led slave raids as far as Iceland, was a middle-class Dutchman who had converted to Islam. Yeah. So this was a middle-class Dutchman who had converted to Islam. Now notice how many converts to Islam suddenly have a hatred of white people. Sinead O'Connor, we're looking at you.
Yeah. Wow, she's lost her marbles.
Yeah, or others that suddenly start wanting to commit jihad because now they've converted and people wonder what the hell just happened. But this is a Dutchman who converts to Islam and becomes one of the most feared pirates on the seas at the time. Now, there is no William Wilberforce or Bartolomeo de las Casas in Islamic history, as there is in Christian history or Western history, that sought to end the slave trade. Now, often when we ask who was the Muslim abolitionist, we hear, no, Muhammad, but he was a slave owner. He was a slave trader. He captured and sexually exploited slaves, and he left a 13th century legacy of divinely sanctioned slavery. So how is he an abolitionist? So now the more we get into the study of Islam, the more we realize that the history we teach ourselves has been artificially edited in order to remove Islam from it. So the story we're told about slavery in America is that evil white men on wooden ships. And I have to thank Paul Warner. He's done some brilliant research in this regard. There are many, there are about 5 people that I read, whose research I use. Paul Warner is one of the preeminent researchers in this field. So we're told white men on wooden ships got slaves off the coast of Africa and brought them to America and sold them. Now there is some truth to this, but also there are parts that are missing. How did the slaves get into the slave pens? How did they come from the middle of Africa to the coasts? Right, the captains of these ships did not capture them. The Americans who went out to get slaves simply bought them at slave auctions, slave markets. They did not go and capture slaves themselves. So they handed over money, they received a bill of sale, and they got an invoice. And the slaves were brought from the heart of Africa. They weren't taken from the coast. They were brought to the coast to be sold. And there was a book written by David Livingstone in 1888. Now, David Livingstone was an abolitionist missionary, Central Africa, and he recorded what this process of taking slaves was like. And this is where it is relevant to understand.
And that's not the David Livingstone I've had on my show.
This is the David Livingstone of Sir David Livingstone, I presume. You may have heard that little legend that he was found in Zimbabwe at Victoria Falls by, was it Zim? Yeah. So David Livingstone writes about this in his diaries in the 1800s. So no, internet wasn't that great back then. So I'm going to read a few passages. It's a fairly lengthy section, but I want to thoroughly cover this subject because I want to point the finger of blame where it also belongs and have people understand the depth of depravity that was going on here. David Livingstone wrote, "Wherever we took a walk, human skeletons were seen in every direction. The sight of this desert, but 18 months ago, a well-peopled valley, now literally strewn with human bones, forced the conviction upon us that the destruction of human life in the Middle Passage, however great, constitutes but a small portion of that waste." So the Middle Passage was the passage from Africa to America. Slaves were treated badly and many died. But he says that no matter how many died in the Middle Passage, far more were killed in the process of taking slaves. From what we know statistically, for every 12 slaves taken, only 1 made it to Arabia. So we're looking at an attrition rate of 11 to 1.
Wow.
So, and that's from Africa to Arabia. Going across the Middle Passage, we're looking, I think, at 5 to 1 death rate. So It took 6 slaves for one to get to America. So the Arabs were holding and capturing these slaves in such a brutal fashion.
Let me ask you something. Let me just interject here. What can you say about, for instance, it's very common in the United States for Black Americans to take on Islam and reject Christianity as being suppressive. What do you say about that?
Well, when you critique Islam, you get told, well, you need to read Arabic. But when you join Islam, no one makes that demand. No one tells you have to understand Arabic to understand Islam. To become a Muslim, all you have to say is the Shahada. And that's it. You're a Muslim now. So you say a short sentence 3 times and Bob's your uncle. There you go. There is no requirement to actually study. And in fact, you are generally discouraged from studying these things. They're being lied to. People are being lied to. It's that simple. And if people understood the truth, they wouldn't join Islam. If people understood the history of Islam, if this were honestly taught in school, people would have a very different view. I think they should understand that they need to genuinely study history without bias. Go look at the facts for themselves, verify what I'm saying, if it's true or not. I'm trying to present the truth as I've researched it. And it is not the religion of Black people. I don't think so.
Yeah, considering that they were enslaved more brutally in Islamic countries than anywhere in the world, and that the white Christians fought harder than anyone else to end slavery, how could they possibly say that, oh shoot, now I can't even think of his name. This 60s leader that led a lot of blacks into Islam.
Not Farrakhan?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Nation of Islam?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a discussion.
It becomes absurd when you realize.
Look, it is. It is. I am aware from my work in security that a number of well-known Black celebrities have become Muslims that have either joined mainstream Sunni schools or Sunni sects, or they've joined with Farrakhan, but they've kept it very quiet. I do know about that. That's a discussion we can have offline. Some of these things I don't understand it, but it's not simply it's based on the lie. They were told a lie and they believed it. So Livingston goes on. They rescued a small group of slaves. Many of the party were children, about 5 years or even less. 2 women had been shot the day before for attempting to untie their thongs in order they might rest. One woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she couldn't carry both it and her load. And a man was dispatched with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body lying on the path. It was said that an Arab who had passed earlier that morning had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk. Now, the man who did this killing is described as an Arab, yet this man is Muslim. So we read the history and we find that Islam is not mentioned. It's been whitewashed. Jihad is not mentioned, and Muslims are not mentioned. Islam's not mentioned, yet all of these are involved. So he notes that not more than 1 in 5 ever reached the slave masters in Cuba. Right? That's the slaves going west. So 1 in 5 survives being taken from the village to the slavery in America. Right? So that's collateral damage of 80%. Right? So we had a long discussion about the slave trade, he goes on. The Arabs have told the chief that their object in capturing slaves is to get them into our possession and make them of our own religion. That religion is Islam. Notice again, it is not mentioned. The evils we have seen, the skulls, the ruined villages, the numbers who perish on the weight of the coast and the sea, the wholesale murders committed by the Wahyu tribe, who were allies, I think I've spelled that one wrong, who were allies with the Muslims to build up Arab villages elsewhere. Why are they capturing these men? Not only to convert them to Islam, but in order to get their wealth so they can take it back to their villages. Right? The strangest disease I've seen in this country really seems to be broken-heartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. They ascribe the pain to their heart. It really seems that the broken heart is the reason that they die. The Arabs would often promise a present to the villagers if they would act as a guide to some distant point. But as soon as they were far enough away from their friends, they were seized and penned into slave sticks, or yokes from which there was no escape. So there's a brutality here which is not openly discussed in history. So we see the brutal process in which slaves are made by the practice of jihad against non-Muslims. So Muslims are supposed to capture non-Muslims, kafirs, and make slaves of them. But we also know there's a large body of Sharia law cases in which black African Muslims complain in courts that the Muslim slave traders will take black African Muslims if they can't find kafirs. So once you're running the slave business, you're not supposed to capture your own, but in order to stay in business, well, if you're a slaver, you're a slaver, and that's what to do. So Muslims ran the slave trade on the west coast of Africa. They also ran it on the Mediterranean coast and the east coast of Africa. So the missing part of the story of slavery in America is this. It was Muslims who captured the Africans to bring them to sell to the white man, to bring them to America. So Muslims tell black Americans that Islam is the religion of the black man, whereas Christianity is the religion of the white man. Yet we see it was the Africans being captured by Islamic slave traders who started the whole process. Now, what else do we not know about history simply because it involves Islam?